It started on a chill autumn morning, the kind where the wind carries memories as easily as leaves. You see, life has a way of teaching you lessons quietly, but when it comes to betrayal, oh, that one slaps you awake like a cold splash of water. Now, I'm not talking about some fancy Hollywood heartbreak. No, this was real life, the kind that seeps into your bones, leaving you questioning every smile and every word that came before. And if you stick with me here, you might just see why sometimes the sweetest smiles hide the sharpest knives. Jack Morrison, a man you'd call steady, dependable, the kind who'd help a neighbor fix a leaky roof without a second thought, had a life that seemed, well, perfect on the surface. At 52, he ran a small family-owned publishing house in Maine. Nothing huge, nothing flashy, but respectable. Enough to keep him comfortable, and most importantly, enough to keep the love of his life, Clara, by his side. Now Clara, well, she was beautiful, but not in that loud, show-off way. No, she was the quiet type, smart eyes, the kind that noticed things others didn't, like the slight tremor in Jack's hands when he thought no one was watching, or the way he hummed while reading letters that never arrived. Jack thought he knew Clara, and hell, he loved her. Every morning they'd share coffee on the porch, watch the fog lift over the river, and trade small talk that somehow felt profound because it was theirs. But as life teaches us, what you see isn't always what you get. That's where this story begins, the kind of moment that starts small, almost imperceptible, like a hairline crack in a dam. It was a Tuesday, the sun barely over the horizon, when Jack noticed something odd. Clara had a habit of leaving her phone tucked into her apron pocket while she made breakfast. But this morning, she had it in her hand, scrolling furiously, her brow furrowed like she was solving some complex puzzle. "Everything all right, hon?" he asked casually, trying not to sound suspicious. She looked up, gave that familiar, almost too perfect smile. "Yeah, just work stuff." But there was a hesitation, a beat too long, and it made Jack's gut twist in a way that's hard to explain unless you've been there. Now, I've told this to plenty of folks, and I always say, listen to that gut. Never ignore it. Call it instinct, call it life experience, call it what you want. But that little warning bell, it's often right. Jack didn't confront Clara that day. He didn't storm the house, accuse her, or make a scene. No, he waited. He watched. And over the next few weeks, small things started adding up. Clara would take work trips that seemed unusually timed. She'd laugh at jokes Jack didn't get. And there were moments, just fleeting moments, when her hand lingered on her phone, staring at messages too long to be just friendly chatter. Now, here's where the moral twist comes in. Most folks would have jumped straight to anger, would have stormed the streets yelling betrayal. But Jack, he was thoughtful, careful. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge starts with patience, observation. The elders I knew always said, revenge is best served cold, but only when you know exactly how it tastes.
One evening, Jack stayed late at the office, pretending to sort invoices, but really, he was watching. Clara had invited a man over, a man he'd seen once at a local diner, looking all too comfortable with the way Clara laughed. Jack's heart didn't just break, it shattered, quietly, methodically. You see, betrayal isn't loud. It's in the whispers, the tiny choices that add up until your whole world tilts. Instead of confronting them, Jack decided he needed proof, evidence, something tangible, undeniable. He set up a small, discreet camera in the living room, the kind you barely notice, the kind you think only existed in spy movies. And that night, he watched. Oh, he watched enough to understand Clara's deception fully. It wasn't just flirtation. It wasn't a harmless affair. It was calculated, deliberate, the sort that makes you rethink every shared memory, every late-night talk, every promise whispered in the dark. And here's the tricky part, the moral dilemma. He could confront her, ruin her life, ruin the man's life, make headlines in his small town. But would that make him feel better? Or would it drag him down, turn him into someone unrecognizable? Jack realized revenge isn't just about punishing the other. It's about preserving yourself. And so he made a choice, a quiet, cunning choice that would shape the next chapters of his life. For the next few days, Jack played the part of the oblivious husband perfectly. He smiled, he laughed, he even planned a small dinner for Clara's birthday. But underneath that calm exterior, he plotted meticulously. He wasn't going to be obvious. No shouting, no drama. He would let her actions speak for themselves. Let her own mistakes weave the web that would eventually ensnare her. But, as I always remind my listeners, and you will understand soon enough, life isn't just about patience or revenge. It's about learning, observing, and understanding the nature of people. You see, Jack began noticing patterns, not just in Clara, but in himself. How easily trust can blind you, how small betrayals can grow into mountains of regret, and how love, no matter how deep, doesn't guarantee loyalty. One night, he followed Clara, not stalker-like, mind you, but carefully, as someone watching a story unfold. She met the man in a small cafe downtown. They whispered, laughed, held hands like teenagers sneaking around. And Jack, he didn't explode. He sat quietly, observing, noting every detail, storing it away. He realized that real revenge isn't just about hurting the other. It's about reclaiming your own power, your dignity. And here's where the classic Bytall story lesson comes in for you folks. Sometimes the world shows you who people are not by their words, but by their choices when they think no one is watching. And in those quiet moments of observation, Jack began to craft the plan, not a petty scheme, not a public humiliation, but a clever, satisfying reversal that would hit the heart of betrayal without destroying his own soul in the process. He reached out to a few trusted friends in his circle, people who understood discretion, who valued loyalty as much as he did. He began gathering information, compiling timelines, connecting dots. And through this, he discovered something unexpected. Clara wasn't just betraying him for lust or excitement. There was greed, manipulation, a financial angle he hadn't anticipated. And suddenly, the story became bigger than personal heartbreak. It was about justice, about setting things right without losing your own humanity. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll know the next steps are crucial. Jack had to act carefully. One false move, one sign of suspicion, and Clara would vanish from his life like smoke, taking her deception with her and leaving him empty-handed. But Jack, he had patience. That, my friends, is what separates a clever mind from a hot-headed fool. So he planned a small dinner, intimate, simple, the kind of evening that seemed innocent, comforting. And during that dinner, he subtly brought up the topics he knew would get Clara to reveal herself further, not directly accusing, but guiding the conversation like a chess master nudging pieces into place. And as she laughed, As she slipped, as she tried to deflect, Jack's quiet mind noted it all. Every pause, every word, every tell. And just when you think he might explode, he doesn't. He just smiles. That calm, knowing smile of someone who has seen betrayal in its raw form and is already 3 steps ahead. That's where we leave part 1, my friends. Jack's world has shifted. Betrayal has been exposed in small glimpses, but the full story, the full revenge, hasn't unfolded yet. And that's the part that will truly grip you, make you lean in, and maybe even reflect on the people around you. So remember this, elders and wise souls alike. Trust your gut, observe before reacting, and never underestimate the power of patience and clever planning. The story's just beginning, and the next chapter, well, it's where Jack begins to weave his web of subtle justice. If you're intrigued, make sure you stick around for the next part, because trust me, you don't want to miss how a quiet man like Jack turns heartbreak into a lesson that will leave Clara, and maybe even all of us, reeling. Now, you remember how I left you last time, right? Jack Morrison knew Clara's betrayal, but he hadn't made a move. That quiet, calculating patience of his was already at work. Some folks might think patience in love is weakness, but let me tell you, patience in the face of betrayal, that's power. The kind that keeps your soul intact while you figure out how to turn the tables without losing yourself. The next morning, Jack woke early, as usual. The fog hung thick over the river, the same one they'd watched together on happier mornings. But today, the quiet brought something different: clarity. He realized revenge isn't about anger, it's about understanding. And in understanding, you often find a path others never even consider. Jack's first step was subtle surveillance, not creepy, mind you, but smart. He began tracking Clara's daily routines, her calls, the small hints that would reveal her patterns. There's a lesson in observation, my friends, and Jack was about to teach it. You see, life often gives you clues about who people really are, if you're willing to pay attention. The smiles, the pauses, the casual phrases, they all tell a story. And Jack read it like a seasoned detective, but with the wisdom of someone who loved and lost. It wasn't long before he noticed something peculiar. Clara had been withdrawing small amounts of money from their shared accounts, always just enough to avoid suspicion. At first it seemed insignificant, almost careless, but Jack knew better. Small leaks often lead to the flood, and this one had the potential to expose much more. Now here's where a moral dilemma comes in, one I want you to really chew on. Jack could have gone to the bank, confronted Clara, and demanded answers, but he didn't. He realized that exposing her immediately would create chaos, resentment, and maybe even irreversible damage to himself. Instead, he decided to use this knowledge wisely, letting her own choices build the story he was about to tell. Classic Bytile story stuff right there. Slow, suspenseful, reflective. Jack's evenings became exercises in quiet strategy. He invited a few trusted friends over, careful not to reveal Clara's betrayal. They discussed business, local happenings, and shared memories that seemed innocent. But beneath the surface, Jack was laying the groundwork for what I like to call invisible justice. You see, revenge that's subtle, clever, and reflective doesn't need drama. It needs precision, patience, and timing. One day, Clara came home unusually cheerful.
Jack raised an eyebrow, smiled faintly, and let her chatter fill the room. He noticed the way she avoided his gaze whenever money came up. That's when he decided it was time for a little gentle test. Nothing overt, just enough to see how far she'd go. He mentioned offhand that a small audit might happen soon, just to keep her cautious. Clara laughed nervously, said it was no big deal, but Jack caught the hesitation. That's all he needed. Here's an important lesson, elders. Betrayal isn't just about the big acts. It's in the tiny, repeated patterns, the small deceptions, and the inconsistencies. Pay attention to those. They're worth more than a confession. Jack was already 3 steps ahead, and every day Clara unknowingly revealed more of herself. But life, as always, loves its twists. Jack discovered something he hadn't anticipated. The man Clara was involved with, let's call him Derek, wasn't just some casual fling. He had ties to people Jack knew, people who could create serious trouble if provoked. That changed things. Jack realized that direct confrontation wasn't just dangerous, it could spiral into something ugly. The stakes were higher than he thought.
Now, Jack had to decide, act fast and risk chaos, or continue the quiet game, letting Clara's own choices expose her fully. That's where wisdom comes in, the kind you earn after years of living, loving, and losing. Jack chose patience, observation, subtle guidance. He began crafting situations where Clara's deception would naturally unravel without him having to force it. One evening, he invited Derek over under the pretense of a casual dinner. Jack's calm demeanor, that quiet authority, set the tone. They talked, laughed, and shared drinks, but Jack was watching. Every glance, every gesture, every slip of the tongue was a piece of the puzzle. He didn't interrupt, didn't accuse, he simply noted. You'll understand why this matters in a moment. The key to clever revenge is simple. Let the betrayer betray themselves. Jack had learned that the hard way. By staying calm, by creating subtle pressure, he allowed Clara and Derek to reveal the depth of their duplicity on their own. It's a lesson for anyone who's been hurt. Patience can be sharper than anger. Now, I want to pause here and highlight something that often goes unnoticed in moral stories for elders. Revenge isn't about satisfying your ego. It's about restoring balance, teaching a lesson, and reclaiming your dignity. Jack knew this, and that's why he never acted rashly. Each carefully observed move brought him closer to a resolution that wouldn't destroy him, but would make the betrayal clear and undeniable. A week later, Clara made a critical mistake. She left her phone unattended on the counter while attending to something in the kitchen. Jack, calm as ever, picked it up discreetly. The messages, the plans, the laughter between her and Derek, it was all there, clear as day. But instead of confronting her, Jack did something clever. He forwarded a few innocuous seeming messages to a mutual friend, someone trusted, framing them as curious business discussions without revealing the affair. This planted seeds, subtle hints that would soon grow into questions and doubts. Here's the moral twist, my friends. Clever revenge often comes without fire and fury. It's in the small, strategic moves that create pressure. And as Clara began to sense subtle changes, the questions, the awkward glances, the whispers of concern, Jack remained calm, composed, untouchable in his quiet dignity. That's where suspense lives in a story for adults. The tension isn't in shouting matches or car chases. It's in the quiet, reflective, almost invisible battles. And just when you think the story is all strategy and patience, life throws another curveball. Derek, growing impatient, made a reckless move. He mentioned financial details he shouldn't have in front of someone who was observing, someone Jack had subtly involved in his plan. That's when Jack realized the full scope of what he could achieve, not just exposing the affair, but revealing the entire web of manipulation, greed, and deceit. Now listen here, this is the part that keeps people hooked in classic Bytall stories. Jack had the power, but the choice wasn't simple. Expose them immediately and enjoy instant satisfaction, or continue the careful dance, ensuring the lesson was felt fully by those involved. Jack chose the latter, and that, my friends, is wisdom. So the evening ended like any other, with Clara unaware that the threads of her betrayal were slowly tightening around her. Jack's eyes held a calm, knowing look, a subtle smile that spoke volumes. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was guiding events with quiet precision, turning deceit into a story that would unravel at the perfect moment.
Now, here's where things start to get interesting, folks. You see, Jack Morrison had spent weeks watching, listening, and observing. Patience had become his weapon, and subtlety his art. But by now, Clara and Derek were starting to feel the edges of the trap closing in, though they didn't know it yet. That's the beauty of clever strategy. The betrayer rarely sees it coming until it's too late. It was a crisp evening, the kind where the sky seems darker than usual and the street lights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Jack sat in his study, reviewing his notes, dates, times, details, the small inconsistencies Clara had left behind. Every laugh, every text, every minor lie had been carefully catalogued, and he knew that now was the moment to push things forward. Not recklessly, mind you. Not with a shout or a confrontation. No, Jack's plan was about finesse. The first move came from a simple, seemingly innocent idea. He arranged a casual gathering at his home, inviting friends from his publishing circle, neighbors, and a few local business partners. Clara, of course, was unaware that this dinner was part of a subtle orchestration, designed to reveal the truth without a single direct accusation. Classic Bytall story style, folks, suspense built with patience, reflection, and clever twists. As the guests arrived, Jack played the perfect host, charming, calm, warm. Clara moved among them, laughing, nodding, trying to maintain the illusion of innocence. Derek, as always, lingered near her, confident in his perceived control. But Jack had arranged the seating carefully. Each person at the table was positioned strategically to observe, to interact, to notice the small things that would eventually unravel the story. Now here's where the first moral twist comes in. Jack didn't want to humiliate Clara in public. That wouldn't teach a lesson. It would only create resentment and chaos. His goal was to guide events so that the truth came to light naturally, allowing Clara and Derek to face the consequences of their own choices. You see, elders, true revenge isn't about anger. It's about clarity, dignity, and reflection. As the evening progressed, casual conversation flowed, but Jack subtly directed topics toward finance, trust, and loyalty. A friend mentioned an issue with a local client. Another joked about missing payments and mistakes in accounting. Clara and Derek shifted uneasily. Jack noticed every micro-expression, every pause, every glance exchanged. They were revealing themselves without realizing it. By dessert, the tension had built almost imperceptibly. Jack, in his calm, measured way, shared a story from his own past about a time when a trusted friend had betrayed him in business. He spoke slowly,
drawing the listeners in, sprinkling lessons about patience, observation, and justice. And while his audience nodded politely, Clara and Derek felt the weight of the lesson directly. The mirror had been held up to their own deception, and they flinched without realizing why. Now here's something important for you to remember. Suspense for adults, particularly in a moral story for elders, doesn't need explosions or drama. It lives in the quiet, reflective moments, the pauses, the glances, the subtle acknowledgement of guilt. Jack knew this. That's why his plan worked so beautifully. Later that week, Jack made another move, even more delicate. He sent Clara a small, anonymous package, a folder with carefully compiled evidence of her financial manipulations and indiscretions. The twist? It wasn't threatening. It wasn't accusatory. It simply presented facts, leaving her to confront the reality of her choices. The message was clear. Jack was aware, but he wasn't angry. He was smarter than that. He was in control. Clara's reaction was exactly what Jack anticipated. She panicked, unsure if whether someone else knew. Derek tried to calm her, but Jack had already orchestrated the subtle exposure to a few mutual friends and colleagues. The whispers began, quiet at first, then gradually louder. The social pressure, combined with the evidence Jack had provided, began to corner them. Classic Indian folklore for seniors style. The clever protagonist using intelligence and patience to turn betrayal into a lesson.
But here's where the moral dilemma deepens. Jack could have escalated further, exposed them publicly, destroyed their lives in one fell swoop, but he didn't. His revenge was measured, deliberate. It was about reclaiming his dignity, demonstrating the consequences of deception, and teaching a lesson in a way that reflected his own values. This is the kind of story that resonates with elders, the ones who've lived long enough to understand that humiliation is cheap, but wisdom is priceless. One evening, Clara confronted Jack in private, her voice trembling, her confidence gone. "Jack, I don't know what's happening. How do you know?" she asked. And Jack, calm as ever, looked her straight in the eye and said, "I've been paying attention, Clara, observing, understanding. That's all it ever takes." She faltered. Derek lingered behind, silent, realizing for the first time that Jack's control was absolute. The moral twist here is critical. Jack hadn't needed to yell, threaten, or coerce. He had simply been smarter, more patient, and more aware. And in that moment, the power dynamics had shifted completely. Now, the next move in Jack's plan was subtle, yet brilliant. He created a situation where Clara and Derek had to interact with people who had already been tipped off, just enough for them to realize that the net was tightening. They stumbled, faltered, and revealed more than Jack could have hoped. Every misstep was recorded in his careful notes, every slip observed. This wasn't about cruelty, it was about clarity and justice, something many moral stories for elders emphasize. And as the week drew to a close, Jack reflected quietly in his study. He knew the climax of his plan was near, but he also knew the importance of timing. True revenge, the kind that teaches a lesson without poisoning the soul, requires patience, subtlety, and moral awareness. He had all three. By now, Jack Morrison's life had quietly shifted. The weeks of patience, observation, and subtle orchestration had begun to bear fruit. Clara and Derek were cornered, not in a dramatic shouting match way, but in a way that left them exposed to the truth of their own choices. And Jack,
He remained calm, composed, dignified, the picture of someone who had weathered betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. The final act began on a Monday morning, the kind of day that seems ordinary until life reminds you how extraordinary consequences can be. Jack had arranged for a casual lunch with a few mutual friends and colleagues under the guise of a simple business meeting. Clara and Derek were unaware that this was a carefully choreographed stage designed for their unmasking without public humiliation. Jack greeted them warmly, his calm demeanor disarming. The conversation flowed naturally at first, about publishing contracts, community projects, and local news. But as often happens in suspenseful tales for adults, subtle hints began to surface, questions, casual remarks, observations. Jack had planted these carefully, knowing they would trigger Clara and Derek to reveal the cracks in their own stories. Here's where the moral lesson really hits home. Real revenge doesn't require cruelty. It requires intelligence, patience, and the ability to let someone's own choices deliver the consequence. Jack never raised his voice. He never shouted accusations. He merely guided the situation with quiet authority, like a seasoned storyteller weaving the plot toward its climax. As the conversation progressed, Clara became increasingly tense. Derek tried to interject, but every word they spoke seemed to dig the hole deeper. Jack noticed each slip, each hesitation, and gently smiled to himself. He had anticipated every move, every excuse. Their deception was unraveling, thread by thread, without him having to force it. Jack then brought up a small local scandal, a situation that mirrored the kind of behavior Clara and Derek had been engaging in. He shared details in a calm, anecdotal way, sprinkling life lessons about trust, loyalty, and the consequences of deception. And here's the subtle brilliance. Clara and Derek began to realize that Jack knew everything, not through confrontation, but through careful observation and patient strategy. The mirror had been held up, and their reflections were undeniable. Now, here's where a gentle moral twist comes in. Jack could have escalated further, publicly shamed them, or used the information to ruin their reputations, but he didn't. Instead, he allowed the natural course of events to expose them fully. Some friends had already noticed inconsistencies and small lies, quietly questioning and observing. The pressure built organically, leaving Clara and Derek no choice but to confront their actions internally. That evening, Jack invited Clara to a quiet conversation. No witnesses, no accusations, just him, the evidence, and the calm authority of someone who had seen betrayal, understood it, and planned a response that reflected his values. Clara faltered under the weight of realization. Derek, realizing the plan's scope, left quietly, understanding that the game was over. Jack spoke softly but firmly. "Clara, it's not about anger. It's about understanding what your choices mean. You've hurt me, yes, but what hurts more is the lack of honesty, the small betrayals that accumulate over time. I didn't need to shout, and I didn't need to humiliate you. I only needed to observe, understand, and let you see the consequences of your own actions." Clara, tearful, could only nod. She realized that Jack's revenge wasn't about punishment. It was about reflection, dignity, and reclaiming his own power. The moral lesson here is clear. Sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't vengeance fueled by anger, but quiet, deliberate wisdom that allows the betrayer to face themselves. That's the essence of a moral story for elders, a classic Baitol story with suspense and subtlety. Over the next few days, life settled into a new rhythm. Clara, humbled, began making amends in small, meaningful ways. Derek withdrew from the picture entirely, recognizing the consequences of his own actions. And Jack? He continued his life with dignity, the quiet satisfaction of having navigated betrayal without losing himself.
Here's a lesson worth noting, especially for those of us in our later years. Revenge isn't about destruction. It's about restoring balance, reclaiming your dignity, and teaching a lesson without poisoning your own soul. Jack's story shows us that patience, observation, and clever strategy can turn betrayal into a profound life lesson, one that resonates more deeply than anger or public shaming ever could. In the weeks that followed, Jack reflected often on the events, sharing his insights with trusted friends. Life, he said, has a funny way of showing who people really are. You just have to pay attention, stay calm, and make your moves wisely. There's no need for theatrics. True power comes from understanding and quiet control. And so, the tale concludes not with dramatic revenge, but with subtle triumph. Clara had learned the consequences of deceit. Derek had understood the cost of manipulation. And Jack, he had proven that intelligence, patience, and moral clarity are far more powerful than anger, shouting, or impulsive actions. Share your thoughts on how you would handle betrayal. It's a lesson worth discussing.